Bloomberg Audio Studios.
Podcasts, radio, news.
You're listening to the Bloomberg Balance of Power podcast. Catch us live weekdays at noon Eastern on Apple CarPlay and Android Auto with the Bloomberg Business app. Listen on demand wherever you get your podcasts or watch us live on YouTube.
Thanks for being with us on the Friday edition of Balance of Power on Bloomberg Radio, on the satellite, and on YouTube, where you can find us now. Search Bloomberg Business News Live, and you'll find our smiling faces here in the studio. If you learn anything today listening to Bloomberg Radio, we're going to give you a couple of chances to do this. Learn this. The economy that matters most is not national. This is the most important story you're going to read on the terminal or online if you care about this race and the 7 swing states we have been talking about for months that are going to decide this election. The economy is not a monolith. Shawn Donnan and his colleagues are out with an incredible piece of journalism today in The Big Take. This is world-class stuff. This is journalism you don't do overnight here. It's a remarkable piece that combines anecdotal evidence in the swing states with hard data that you would expect from Bloomberg. These 7 states, home to 61 million people, a combined gross domestic product in 2023 of $4.4 trillion, showing economic cracks that could prove a political obstacle for Vice President Kamala Harris, as I read in the story. Shawn's with us at the table right now. It's great to see you. Congrats on a great story here.
Thanks so much.
In fact, it's
Wonderful
about
to be
100
here.
stories in one, well, at least 7. If you want to see a real great marriage, as I said, of data and anecdotal journalism, this is it. Let's start in the blue wall states. What do our listeners need to know about the difference in these economies, Michigan, Wisconsin, Pennsylvania, than where some of us may live?
Yeah, look, there's a fundamental thing that we found here, and that is that those blue wall states, which are the kind of the core of the campaign right now, that's where the Democrats are focused. And where the Republicans are hoping to exploit some weaknesses. And the reality is they've grown since 2019 at a third of the rate of the rest of the United States when you adjust for inflation and population changes and so on. And that means that, you know, when Joe Biden was the candidate and when he was out there talking about the great and this remarkable national recovery that we've seen in the economy from the pandemic recession, he was talking about a national recovery. But in the blue wall, that story looks very different. And in particular, we went to a place called Erie County. That place has been one of the slowest places to recover from the pandemic recession. By the end of 2022, which is the last data we have available, it was actually 3.2% smaller, that economy, once you adjust for inflation, than it was before the pandemic.
Well, you guys spent time, and you mentioned Erie County. You went there and talked to real people, which is why partly this story is wonderful. One of them was Curtis Jones Jr., former Erie Democratic City Councilman. Here's what he had to say.
We see projects, we see economic development happening, but don't always say, oh, that's because of the Biden administration or it's because of the governor. Like, most people aren't thinking that way. The average person is struggling. It's an interesting dichotomy, almost like the tale of two cities, right? So you've got funding for business development, economic development projects in our downtown, but we're also seeing, regrettably, an increased number of unhoused and underhoused in our community. Individual households are struggling significantly because of the cost increases.
Really interesting take here, and there are 2 numbers that are awfully important about Erie that you point out. One, GDP per capita, 3.2% smaller by the end of 22 than it was in 2019. The other one is Joe Biden won the county by only 1,400 votes in 2020.
Yeah.
You put those together, you've got a challenge.
You've got a challenge. You've also got a continuing challenge in that the manufacturing sector there hasn't seen the recovery that you've seen, or the increase in jobs that you've seen in some of the Sun Belt states like Georgia and Arizona and so on. It's a place that's continuing to lose population as well. So, you know, the unemployment rate looks at a historic low. But there's 10% fewer people working in factories than there were just 10 years ago.
That's incredible. So talk to us more about the Sun Belt states, because we've been hearing that there could be a new path here for this Harris ticket. It's different than Biden. And yes, it's Georgia. It's also Arizona, where you find that the housing squeeze is still severe.
Yeah, no, look, if you look at Arizona, which has been the real outperformer in terms of the swing states in terms of growth, right? So in terms of real GDP per capita growth, they grew about 12% between 2019 and the end of 23. That's good, right? And a lot of that is a result of investment in new chips plants there, a big increase in the population there. But again, when you start looking on the ground, you start finding housing costs have gone up remarkably. They've doubled since 2019. For a median household in a place like Arizona or Nevada, they were paying 18 to 20% of their income on their mortgage on a median house in 2019. That's now up around 36, 37% in those states. That's a meaningful difference for most families in terms of just getting some shelter over them.
Yeah, absolutely. We like to say on Bloomberg that context matters, and this is a pretty great example of it. Congrats on a great piece, Shawn, and thanks for talking with us here on Balance of Power.
Thanks so much for having me.
You can find it, of course, on the podcast as well, on the terminal and online. A great story here on The Big Take that I encourage you to check out, to have a better, not just to sound smart at the cocktail party, that'll be the case too, but to have a better understanding of these debates that we have every day on this program. Each of these states brings a different component and a different challenge to both campaigns as it's borne out in the data, as well as the real human beings we talk to. Speaking of real human beings, we have two of them on our great panel today. It's time to assemble. Jeanne Zaino, Bloomberg Politics contributor, of course, senior democracy fellow at the Center for the Study of the Presidency and Congress, and political science professor at Iona University. Maura Gillespie is here too, Republican strategist and founder of Blue Stack Strategies. Wonderful panel and great to see you both. Welcome today. Jeanne, I'd like to ask you about some of what we just learned. This is fascinating to me as you make your way through the blue wall, through the Sun Belt. Each state has a different economic story to tell, and Kamala Harris is going to find out firsthand as she travels to these states this week that their economies are not, in many cases, keeping up with the rest of the country. If the swing states are going to decide this election, Jeanne, how does Kamala Harris win with that in mind?
Well, can I first say I need to have Shawn come talk to my students about great data-driven journalism, because this, to your point, is a great piece. And, you know, I think what Kamala Harris does have this challenge on the economy, regardless about how well received she has been. People still give the Republicans and Donald Trump much higher numbers on the economy. This has been the story of this election, pre-Kamala Harris's ascension and post. And I think the irony of this race is that regardless of how sour people are on the economy, Donald Trump hasn't yet been able to use that, and it's only been a few weeks, against Kamala Harris. And we saw this on display yesterday. Right when he starts to talk about economic issues, he seems to get distracted by things like crowd sizes and his hate for Brian Kemp. And, you know, part of the irony is that you can think of almost any traditional Republican candidate being able to make this case on the economy against Kamala Harris. But because Donald Trump is so distracted by the things he really cares about, like crowd size, or, you know, the fact that, you know, he can't figure out, you know, things about like the election being stolen and comparisons between Alabama and Mississippi in 2020, that he doesn't talk about the economy in the way he should. And so that's where Kamala Harris gets this advantage.
Maura, does Jeanne have a point there? Staying on the economy is productive when you look at the map here for Donald Trump, because otherwise we're talking about advantage Trump in all of these states, aren't we?
Absolutely. And I think Jeanne makes a good point that he does get so distracted. So sometimes especially watching yesterday, I thought, does he actually want to win? Because if he talked about the economy, talked about safety and security, those are two policy issues that are going to be very important come November. And yet he gets himself all spun up about the media not reporting his accurate crowd sizes, comparing himself to having the same crowd size as Martin Luther King Jr. and his I Have a Dream speech. I mean, these are things that and I believe in about 5-10 years, we're going to look back and cannot believe that this is what was said by the not only former president, but somebody who is leading the pack here to become the next president. So if Republicans watching this who are running down ballot could just focus on the economy, their policy issues, that would be strong for re-election or for election, then they will do well come November. I don't know that I can say the same about Donald Trump, but I do think that Republicans should be really focused on those two main issues and campaigning on those to make a dent come November.
You know, Jeanne, I'm struck by the presence of COVID in the data here. The 7 swing states have a disproportionate share of their population living in counties that had not yet recovered to their pre-pandemic levels. We're talking GDP here by the end of 2022. And when you isolate those counties that did not recover to their pre-pandemic level, a vast majority of them were carried by Donald Trump in the 2020 election. That could happen again here, correct?
It absolutely could. I mean, the numbers are on his side when you look at the public opinion poll numbers. I mean, and people really do think that if they are asked who they trust more with their economy, it is going to be Donald Trump and the GOP. And I think what Kamala Harris needs to try to do is to talk specifically about what Donald Trump has said his plans are. Most economists say his plans, as he has laid them out, are inflationary. So if we do get a Fed cut in interest rates come September, that'll be a point for Harris and Biden to celebrate that. Many Americans will likely see that as a sign that inflation is going down and in the right direction. We're moving in the right direction. And so, you know, this would be something that they could use and juxtapose what his plans are versus her plans. But again, it's not something she's going to have to address until and unless he starts to talk about the economy specifically. And I would just add, his job has become harder since she has ascended because, of course, now, even though she's from the incumbent administration, she can talk about what she plans to do as president. She doesn't have as much defending to do as a Joe Biden would have.
Is it just about talking about the economy, Maura? Donald Trump can criticize Joe Biden clearly when it comes to these data all day long. Or does he need a plan on how to lower prices? What's his inflation plan? So far, all we've heard is drill, baby, drill.
For the MAGA supporters, he can just continue to hit on the Biden-Harris administration and the ways that he believes they destroyed our economy. He can hit on that all day long, and MAGA will come out for him and will rally behind that messaging. But I think for those voters who are not so keen on Donald Trump, but really don't see any path that they're going to vote for Kamala Harris, he needs to try and reach them and convince them to vote for him as opposed to a third party or a write-in opportunity there. So he needs to talk about what it is that he plans on actually doing. Again, I watching some of these rallies in Georgia, watching yesterday's speech or press conference, it makes me feel as though he doesn't actually want to be president. He just wants this fanfare around him having the attention and having people, fairly or kindly talk about him in the media. And unfortunately for the American people, that's going to be a problem if we, again, see an administration which is not reflective of what he had in 2016. Most of those people he had with him are gone. So what is it that he plans to do should he become president? And who is he bringing in with him? I mean, I think these are questions that voters really need to get a handle on before they get to the polls in November.
Yeah. Well, I find it really interesting to put a cap on this conversation about the swing states and their economies. Kamala Harris and Tim Walz today are in Arizona and Nevada. Donald Trump is in Bozeman, Montana. And I'll just leave that there for right now.
You're listening to the Bloomberg Balance of Power podcast. Catch us live weekdays at noon Eastern on Apple CarPlay and Android Auto with the Bloomberg Business app. You can also listen live on Amazon Alexa from our flagship New York station. Just say, Alexa, play Bloomberg 1130.
Welcome to the fastest show in politics, the Friday edition of Balance of Power, live from Washington. You made it to the threshold of the weekend. As the campaigns continue travel, we've got a couple of big ones today. Importantly, the Kamala Harris-Tim Walz campaign sticking to the swing states we've been talking about so much, Arizona and Nevada today, where Donald Trump, interestingly, is in Bozeman, Montana for his one rally of the week here, raising questions about the travel schedule, not to mention the deployment of resources in other areas. That's where we start with Gregory Korte, Bloomberg Politics reporter. It's great to see you, Gregory. These are obviously valuable days for both campaigns. And as we watch the Democratic ticket do 6 swing states this week, How is the Trump campaign managing itself in Montana?
Yeah, it seems almost like an October fever that we have, and it's only August. This was a question that former President Trump was asked at his news conference yesterday in Mar-a-Lago. He got testy at the question. The question was, why aren't you in the swing states? He says, look, I'm here. I'm talking to you. I'm campaigning from Mar-a-Lago. I'm on the phone all of the time. But, the two most valuable things that any campaign has is one is the hard money, the dollars, the campaign contributions to put up TV ads. And the other is the candidate's time. And where the candidate spends his or her time says a lot about how they see the map, which voters they're trying to motivate. And at this point, Kamala Harris and Tim Walz are working the swing states, and Donald Trump is working Mar-a-Lago and, as you point out, Montana, which is very important in the Senate context.
Right.
But I think both parties would agree they'd much rather have the White House.
So let's talk about this news conference. By the way, it was a news conference. There were actual reporters' questions, which is not always
including
the case
one
at
from our
Mar-a-Lago.
own Nancy Cook, who is there.
That's right. Yeah. The couple of planted questions, too, I understand, from some of the folks who were there asking about various things. But we played the greatest hits here. I don't think Hannibal Lecter made an appearance, but all the other stuff did here, including crowd sizes. We're doing crowds. So he's talking about MLK's crowd size for the I Had a Dream speech. Isn't that the definition of a distraction?
Ed, you remember a couple weeks ago we were in Milwaukee at the Republican convention. We were talking about how after the assassination attempt, the attempt on Trump's life, he was going to be a sort of a new candidate. He was going to have a new sort of rhetoric. He was going to downplay all of those sort of greatest hits that you're talking about. And of course, we're right back to the same Trump. He can't help himself. And it doesn't matter whether it's a rally or a convention nomination acceptance speech or a press conference. He's going to go back to some of those same themes as he always does. And his divergences. We didn't get, as you said, Hannibal Lecter. We did get a little bit of an aside on the acoustics of Mar-a-Lago, how much it was worth. $18
million.
$18 million is according
to
that
room, I think.
Yeah. So it's this is the Trump we have come to know as Americans over the past 8 years.
That's the Trump you're going to get, apparently, attempted assassination or not. But we're playing with some pretty hot stuff here. It's not just crowd sizes. It's racial tropes. It's stolen valor. Is this the campaign?
Again, this goes back to, I think, the comment I made earlier. Like, this feels like October.
Yeah.
These are October-level attacks.
October's in 5 minutes, by the way. We are in the sprint now. This is the fast-forward time.
Absolutely. Although, there used to be a day, I'm old enough to remember, when before Labor Day, both parties kind of thought, well, people aren't really paying attention yet.
Yeah, right.
We'll do some organizational work.
I keep hearing that, actually.
But no, it's a dog days. We haven't even had the Democratic convention yet. And these kind of fever pitch attacks, which have become more common in American politics over the past decade or so, certainly Trump has contributed to it. But, to be fair, Democrats also have engaged in some somewhat crude insinuations about J.D. Vance, which I'm not going to repeat here, but I think people can probably use their imagination. It's a furniture-related line of attack.
Heard that.
So, this is the state of our politics now.
Yeah. So let's talk about the Democrats more for a minute, because Kamala Harris is getting a lot of criticism, and you could even argue the main reason why Donald Trump did that yesterday is because people want her to have a news conference, stand there for 45 minutes or an hour, take questions, sit down and have a hard-hitting interview with a journalist. I don't know if they're at the point yet where they have to do this. As you said, we're going into the convention. There are a lot of things happening. They're introducing a running mate. But there is something real to that.
Well, yes, and as you know, because you've been in this business a long time too, the longer she goes without doing it, the more the bubble inflates.
The harder that interview will be too.
Expectations fall on that interview or that press conference or whatever venue it takes. She did take some questions, a few of them on the tarmac yesterday, I think it was. But yeah, look, she has won the Democratic nomination for president without a single delegate voting, or the single primary or caucus voter voting for one of her delegates. Those delegates have now switched over to her, but she has not had to make the case in the same grueling primary process that we usually put our presidential candidates through of why she's the best candidate for president of the United States. Yeah. She is not on the record on a number of different questions of how her views of the world may differ from the person who she has served under as president, and Joe Biden. And so, yeah, those questions are going to mount until she starts to go out and answer some of them.
I still say they take the edge off by doing a sit down with the two of them, right? Kamala Harris, Tim Walz, sit down with friendly, whatever, do entertainment, whatever you got to do, and then follow it up with the hard-hitting interview.
You start with the
Here I am
shows,
giving campaign advice on the air.
Do a little bit of lifestyle-like things.
Dare I say couch? You said do the couch interview on the morning show, right?
Absolutely.
That's what's coming. Okay.
Yeah.
Campaign advice from Gregory Korte, not me. It's great to see you. Bloomberg politics reporter, not your job indeed, but he covers politics with the best of them, and it's great to have you at the table always, Gregory. I'm Joe Mathieu in Washington. As we recall the news conference at Mar-a-Lago, you saw and heard it live in its entirety. Well, we were just talking about this a short time ago. Here's a taste of Donald Trump holding forth with reporters at Mar-a-Lago.
If you look at January 6th, which a lot of people aren't talking about very much, I think those people were treated very harshly. When you compare them to other things that took place in this country where a lot of people were killed, nobody was killed on January 6th. Of course there'll be a peaceful transfer, and there was last time, and there'll be a peaceful transfer. I just hope we're going to have honest elections. So I think the abortion issue has been very much tempered down. Nobody's spoken to crowds bigger than me. If you look at Martin Luther King, when he did his speech, his great speech, and you look at ours, same real estate, same everything, same number of people, if not, we had more.
To think that was out of an hour. We could keep playing things for quite a while. The Associated Press, by the way, did a little bit of homework on that. For the record, Martin Luther King Jr.'s crowd that day was 25 times larger than Donald Trump's was on the 6th of January, not to mention some of the other things that happened that day, as he refers to a peaceful transition of power. This is where we start our conversation with the gentleman from Maryland. Congressman Glenn Ivey is with us, Democrat representing Maryland's 4th District, which I drive through every day on my way to work. Congressman, it's great to see you. Thanks for coming in.
Thanks for having me.
It's a pleasure to have you in person here. I'm not going to drag you through this campaign stuff for our entire conversation because there are a couple of issues I'd really like to hit with you. But let's start there. The rhetoric that we're hearing in this campaign is one that's concerning a lot of folks, as we're now regressing into racial tropes, stolen valor, the rest that you're hearing along with us. How does the Harris-Walz campaign respond to that?
Well, so far I think they've been able to almost ignore it because many of those comments contain critiques within themselves.
Is that the best defense?
Yeah, I think it depends. I'll have to see how things play out. And if he keeps doing press conferences like the one yesterday where it's just one bizarre statement after another. Yeah. The January 6th comments, for example, where you've had, I think, over 1,000 people have been convicted of criminal offenses, some for sedition and things like that. He keeps trying to downplay these things and act like they were just tourists there that day, but that's obviously preposterous. So, he'll keep undermining his own campaign the way your commentators talked about previously. I'm pleased with the way Harris and Walz are focusing on issues I think American voters are more interested in hearing about, some of which you just touched on a few minutes ago, like the economy.
Yeah.
And I think we have to, stay on our track, and I don't know if they'll ever get on track themselves, but I think we're going in the right direction.
Should Governor Walz clarify some of the questions about his military career? Is that part of the campaign?
Yeah, I think he's talked about that some. My view so far is that, I think the focus has been on the use of the term war. The United States was at war essentially with, over in Afghanistan at the time. So I think it's factually correct on its face. But the larger piece, he was in, I think, the Guard for 24 years, if I'm not mistaken.
Yes.
And
he left 2 months before his unit deployed to Iraq. They're saying that he abandoned his brothers in arms. That's a heavy charge.
It's a heavy charge. I think he left to run for Congress. I thought it was 10 months too, but maybe I've got the wrong number. But the bottom line is there's no indication of any kind of misconduct or stolen valor or anything along those lines. And when you contrast that with Donald Trump, who pretty much ducked out on service during the Vietnam era, he got the doctor in his father's building to give him bone spurs deferral.
Yeah.
I don't know. I don't know that he
times,
can.
I believe.
Yeah, I don't know if he can cast the first stone. So,
well, you wonder if they're trying to encourage that debate, which would be curious, Congressman. I guess broadly, though, we're talking about, they're calling this the vibes campaign. There's this new energy that has changed the ground under our feet. You can speak to that as you wish. You're a Democrat. I'm sure you're very excited about what's happening. But have you ever seen a moment like this where an aircraft carrier of a presidential campaign turned on a dime?
No.
This has been in 2 weeks.
Yeah, this is pretty dramatic. And, the Obama campaign in 2008 had similar kinds of energy, but it took a long time for it to ramp up to that point. A little bit 1968, Bobby Kennedy, just as he was hitting his stride before he was assassinated. But that's kind of it in my recollection. And, I think she's doing a couple things with that are positive. One is she's sustaining it. Mm-hmm. It looks like the Walls pick. I know there were some people that wanted other selections, but it looks like it's worked out very well and sort of rallied the troops in any event, including, people who wanted other candidates to be picked. Mm-hmm. And I think she's also continuing to dominate the media. I think part of the reason Trump had the press conference yesterday was he's been sidelined in part by his own silly comments, but also because of the rise of her campaign. Mm. And I think he's trying to figure out a way to get back into it. They had Vance following them around for a couple of days, kind of nose pressed up against the window. Yeah, it was kind of funny. But, it's clear that they're a little desperate and confused about how to go forward.
Does she need to hold a news conference, do some of these interviews? That's the challenge right now, is that she's not answering questions.
Yeah, I don't mind, her doing that. I think it's there's going to be plenty of time for a variety of types of news conferences like that. But the introducing herself and her vice presidential candidate, I think, are the way to go right now. So I like the speeches in the battleground states. The big rallies make sense. Continuing to push the high energy events make a lot of sense. And, she can ride that out, I think, going forward.
I want to ask you about the Senate race in Maryland. You've endorsed Angela Alsobrooks, who's running against a Republican who's not talking a lot like a Republican. Larry Hogan, your former governor, is criticizing Donald Trump. He's very disappointed, he said, by the news conference. What we need to do is focus on the issues. He held a news conference, an interview, I should say, rather, with Punchbowl. And he was talking about his opponent, Angela Alsobrooks, of course, Prince George's County executive who's running for an historic candidacy for Senate.
Right.
Larry Hogan said, my opponent really wants to make this about red versus blue. Just Democrat versus Republican. Probably take the names off the ballots and all of our records and say you have to vote blue. Our campaign, he says, is about red, white, and blue. Is there some truth to that?
Not on the ads that I've seen.
Okay.
The ads I've seen, he's running as a Democrat, basically. So he said yesterday I saw one of his ads. It's choosing people over politics.
Okay.
Now that is the House Democrats' slogan for this
that?
for this cycle. That's
what we hear from Hakeem Jeffries.
Yeah, exactly. And then he talked about abortion.
So he's not a real Republican, is what you're saying.
Well, he certainly isn't running on their issues, and he's a million miles away from what Donald Trump's focus could be, I suppose, given what his commentaries have been. The problem is twofold. One is his record, which is, I think, more significant than what he's saying now. He was never supportive, particularly of abortion rights, and so he was able to get away with that because his races for governor occurred before Dobbs repealed Roe v. Wade. Now he can't do that, and the big problem he's got is that if he does get elected, he's already said he would sit with the Republican caucus. What that would mean is 51 votes. That has an impact on future Supreme Court selections, which certainly Democrats in Maryland are troubled by what Trump's done in the Supreme Court already. And then on the abortion issue, which there's a huge wing in the Republican Party that really wants to nationalize the bans that have taken place in some states. And then you get to gun violence and other issues along those lines where, the Republicans, for example, just on guns, ghost guns. You can't get one Republican co-sponsor to ban ghost guns in the House, which is crazy. I mean, the only reason you would have a ghost gun is if you want to evade prosecution because there's no serial numbers on
These
it.
are the guns with the serial numbers scratched.
That's right.
The
guns are made without serial numbers at all, just so that you can avoid prosecution. We can't get one Republican co-sponsor. He's not going to be able to duck those kinds of issues, I don't think, as we go forward.
As you consider all the questions you hear, the issues that arise from Oxon Hill, from your district, and now the need for money to rebuild the Francis Scott Key Bridge. In our remaining moment, how are you going to get that done? Is that in the lame duck? Is it next year? How do you get the money?
I think the push is to try and get it done now. And obviously what happens in November could have an impact on that in a very significant way.
Yeah.
We need to get the funding up front for the bridge because it's going to take years for the insurance cases.
So you need to get this done before the election, is your point?
Well, I'm saying that depending on who wins, I don't know what Trump would do if he gets elected.
That would jeopardize funding for the bridge, you think?
I think it could. Yeah. I mean, some of the things that he's talked about and the Trump Project 2025, policy positions. We're talking about all kinds of radical changes. Another one, the House Republicans came out with a paper to eliminate building the new FBI headquarters and shut that down, even though we've been awarded that in Maryland.
That's right.
And try and move the whole thing to Alabama, which is like a little,
thought
crazy.
They wanted to go to Quantico. Hang on a second. Congressman, I'm really glad you came in. We want to keep tabs with you, and I want to see you in Chicago. You're going to be at the DNC, right?
Absolutely. I look forward to seeing you there.
Let's make a plan. We'll meet right here on this program. Glenn Ivey, the Democrat from Maryland, Oxon Hill. As I said, we drive through the district every day on our way to work. We'll have a lot more ahead. This is Bloomberg.
You're listening to the Bloomberg Balance of Power podcast. Catch us live weekdays at noon Eastern on Apple CarPlay and Android Auto with the Bloomberg Business app. Listen on demand wherever you get your podcasts or watch us live on YouTube.
Pretty remarkable to think that in 1 week we're on our way to Chicago, and we're going to be bringing you special coverage of the Democratic National Convention in Chicago with so many issues flying around this campaign, whether it's the economy, abortion, the border, or yes, geopolitics. And we hear a lot about how voters tend not to key their decisions off geopolitical stories, but foreign policy might well make the grade, considering two hot wars underway right now, not only Ukraine, but great questions about our policy in Israel. And you know that, of course, is swirling around the Harris campaign, with the potential now for a ceasefire. I know you've heard me say this before, but we're following parallel storylines today in Israel. One is the anticipated retaliation from Iran over the killings of Hezbollah and Hamas officials. The other is the potential for a ceasefire with Hamas, with reporting today that the president, leaders of Egypt and Qatar say they are prepared to present a final ceasefire proposal. If you're reading the terminal, you see that new round of ceasefire talks now set for August 15th. Very important as we add the voice of Maura Rudman, professor at the Miller Center at the University of Virginia, director of the Ripples of Hope Project, focused on democratic solutions. Maura, it's great to have you back. I don't know how you have both of these stories existing at once. And I'm going to point you to one more headline that crossed the terminal a short time ago from Reuters. Biden to lift offensive weapons sales ban to Saudi Arabia. When you factor that in, are we on the verge of a ceasefire breakthrough?
We've been at this point before, as you've noted. Everything is possible, which means that I would say we're at an inflection point. We can be moving toward the ceasefire, and those are key meetings next week, August 15th. It's also significant that Qatar, Egypt, and the United States together put out the statement about pushing for the August 15th meeting and about presenting a bridging proposal. At the same time, it's very unclear what Iran will be doing, what Hezbollah's calculations are. And so the next several days are just critical.
That's for sure. I just don't get, and maybe I'm being a little too simple here, Maura, how you can strike a ceasefire while Israel is also bracing for a potential retaliation from Iran. Are you thinking that won't happen?
No, I think that the two are actually interlinked. I'm going to bring you back to something that that Prime Minister Yitzhak Rabin, who was so tragically assassinated by some of the very people related to folks in Bibi Netanyahu's cabinet. But Prime Minister Rabin used to talk about fighting for peace as if there was no war, and fighting wars as if there was no peace. And living in that combined space at the same time is typical, not just for this region, but for many conflicts where you've got to look for ways to talk and to get to resolution. And at the same time, you've got to be prepared to fully defend yourself.
Mm-hmm. We remember, of course, what happened in April when Iran did respond. And the refrain that we've heard across the spectrum is that Hezbollah is not looking for a wider war. Iran is not looking for a wider war. And of course, Israel is not. Do you believe that to be true?
Yes, I believe that all of the actors, for a variety of reasons, recognize that a wider war is not in their interest. Sadly, in this kind of situation, that doesn't always mean that their actions will not trigger that wider war. And the role of the United States, in this case also of Egypt, Qatar, of the Saudis, of everyone else in the region and throughout the world, is to try to stress that longer term perspective, to try to keep folks away from the trigger finger, so as to speak, and to give incentives to the fullest extent possible to reach for what is in everyone's long-term interest, which is to avoid this tit for tat now.
Well, we're at a moment where a lot could happen here. And we remember May 31st, the day that Joe Biden addressed the nation, the world, from the White House with a 6-point ceasefire plan that he said Israel had signed off on. We saw, of course, in the days following that Benjamin Netanyahu may have signed off on something in principle, but was clearly not on board with the details at hand. Why should the White House trust him now?
So the White House is working with the state of Israel, and it's working as well with Qataris and Egyptians who are working with Hamas. The challenge that all of those who are trying to bring about the ceasefire face is that there are elements for Prime Minister Netanyahu and for Yahya Sinwar, the head of Hamas, where any kind of ceasefire agreement is not in their direct, immediate political interest. And yet, for many of the people around them, in the case of Bibi Netanyahu, frankly, his entire military and security establishment, as well as the people of Israel, certainly the families of hostages, are pushing very hard for the nature and scoping of the ceasefire proposal that has been laid out. And in the case of Hamas, it's not just the countries around. Many Palestinians in Gaza are brave enough, courageous enough to speak out on the record about the challenges and how much they need a ceasefire, which takes a tremendous amount of risk and peril for them, given the vicious kind of leadership of Yahya Sinwar.
Mm-hmm. We've been surging military assets into the region, even more than we already had. Maura, F-22 jets now included, several more destroyers in the region. What are we planning for? What are we prepared to do to defend Israel if this retaliatory strike does come?
Well, what we've put into the region is certainly a show of force, and part of a strong deterrence, the strongest deterrence you can mobilize is to show the willingness to be able to defend and to help defend. And so that is part of what is going on right now. Certainly the United States showing, with what you've described, what we are willing to bring into the region to help Israel defend itself, and any number of private conversations that are going on with players throughout the region, as was reported earlier today, the Jordanians, the Saudis, the Egyptians, others are all talking to Iran as well about scaling this back, about the longer term interests of everyone in the region. Jordanians have been clear about not using their airspace for either side, frankly, which is part of, I think, how the kingdom there is trying to position itself to, again, damp down actions that could really result in tragedy across the region.
Fast forward to August 15th, again, the ceasefire talks that have been scheduled, the U.S., Qatar, Egypt. Is this Secretary of State Antony Blinken, or is this Bill Burns at the table for the United States? Do we know?
It's probably a combination. I think that Bill Burns has been the primary leader of this effort, of the behind the scenes. I think that Brett McGurk, who's at the White House at the NSC, works for Jake Sullivan, the National Security Advisor, is very much kind of day-to-day hands-on. But Bill Burns clearly has a whole team as well. And I'm sure that Secretary Blinken is also very much involved. So it is a full team effort.
August 15th is next Thursday. Maura, what's more likely in that time? That we do have a breakthrough on a ceasefire, or Iran strikes Israel?
I don't want to put odds on that kind of situation. Honestly, what I try to remain focused on is what's so clearly in the United States' interest, in Israel's interest, in the interests of all those in the region, and absolutely for the hostages and their families, which is to reach a ceasefire deal. And doing so is obviously going to be much more possible in the near term if there are not actions by Hezbollah or by Iran in this intervening time period, which will certainly escalate and make a ceasefire that much more difficult.
Yeah, I only have a minute left here, Maura. We're in the throes of an important election here in the United States. To what extent would a Trump presidency embrace this ceasefire proposal? I'm assuming Kamala Harris would be in continuity with Joe Biden.
I think that's correct in terms of all signs that Kamala Harris has given. And in terms of a Trump administration, really, who knows? He has been all over the place on this issue. He was quite harsh to Israel and to the prime minister immediately after October 7th in a way that was surprising to people. He's also talked in ways he's not a negotiator, despite his let's make a deal kind of aura, the President Trump. He's not used to how you create win-win situations as opposed to zero sum. And this is a situation where you've got to figure out ways to get through that lead to a ceasefire deal. So I'm very concerned, perhaps not surprisingly, about how a Trump administration might handle what is going on now and kind of any future in the region.
From the Miller Center at the University of Virginia, Maura Rudman. It's great to have you back, Maura. Thank you so much for the insights at another very important moment here in geopolitics. Thanks for listening to the Balance of Power podcast. Make sure to subscribe if you haven't already at Apple, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. And you can find us live every weekday from Washington, D.C. at noontime Eastern at Bloomberg.com.